Run.
All right. We are pressing through Matthew chapter 14. We were discussing last time the beheading of John. We spent a lot of time discussing Herod and his involvement in it, and how it was that because of, number one, a weak character, Herod being a son of Edom, coming from that lineage, and that's the lineage of Esau, coming from that lineage and their mindset being set on things which are carnal, things that are physical and things that are materialistic. And even throughout Israel's history, they go into Egypt, they come back out of Egypt, and they're having to make their way through the land of Canaan, or to the land of Canaan rather. They actually send delegates or a letter to the king of Edom. That's their cousin. And ask them for permission to be able to pass through. They simply say, we'll go through the king's highway. We will not go to the right or to the left. We won't even drink of any of your water. Just let us pass through. And Edom says, no, you're not going to be allowed to go through here. And in fact, not only did they not allow Edom to go through, but as they are wandering in the wilderness, Edom is continuously coming behind the children of Israel and waging war with them. They're attacking the stragglers all throughout Israel's wandering. And now here we come, and here's Edom, and they're in charge. It's no wonder that we have Herod, or the line of Herods, being the way that they are. So we mentioned the influence that's being had on Herod, but we also now want to take into consideration Herodias, the wife that Herod is not supposed to have. When we consider that, number one, what Herodias did, she danced in front of Herod so as to make the kind of request that she made. She used sensualness to influence Herod. And her mother is involved in the process too, to where Herod makes the oath. Herodias goes back to her mother. She's already made plans with her mother. You ask for John's head on a plate. Now you just think about it. What hope does the world have with women like this in it?
Is it Herodias or Salome?
Do what now?
You're saying Herodias, but wasn't it Salome that was dancing?
No, it's Herodias.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Herodias, Philip, his brother's wife. Now, we have a saying in our society, and it's illustrating the power that mothers have. What about the hand that rocks the cradle? Is Jamie the only one that knows that saying?
Rules the world.
Yeah.
Don't bite the hand that feeds you.
No. The hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. Mothers play a large influence into the development of their children. And these are the kind of women that are out there. And you just picture a home that's being brought up under the influence of Herodias, under the influence of her mother. That is a terrible place to have to grow up and to have to get your development from. And at some point in this chain, in this lineage, somebody's going to have to wake up to the realization, you know what, the way we've been doing things inside of our family structure is not how it needs to be done. That somebody has to come along and break that cycle. But how difficult is that to do? It's very difficult. We can look around in our own society, and you watch how the parents behave and how they react and how they behave in front of their children. What are they doing? They're just setting up the next generation so as to live like they did. This is normal to us. But then we are on the outside and we view this and it's like, whoa, this is not normal. The chaos that you are continuously living in, the dysfunction that you have going on, that is not good. That is not normal. And there are going to have to be things you're going to have to weed out. That whether it be daughters or sons that are looking at their fathers, you're going to have the realization that there are some things that I have picked up from my parents that I need to leave behind. How they would react to situations, what I am comfortable with and what I would view as being normal in how I react to situations, that's not how I need to react. That in fact we are striving to go into the Scriptures and find out how are parents supposed to deal with their children. I mean, for example, fathers with their sons, what are you not supposed to do? Provoke them to emulation or provoke them to wrath. It's easy for fathers to do to their sons. Because what do you have? You have two male egos that are going at it. And thus you have, in that situation, you're being taught, you're being shown. Here's how you're to react to your children when they do something wrong. Or when they try to push back, because naturally that's going to come. Boys grow up, they're striving to be men and they're wanting to come into their own. And then to a large degree, fathers do not want to take on the role of the prodigal son's father, to where it's just, okay, you want to do this, do this. A lot of fathers would see that too much as being a challenge. You know, you're trying to challenge my authority. And then there ends up being a conflict. But that father was just, okay, you want to come into your own? Go. You don't have to stay here. I've been training you up. I've been trying to teach you. But you're having to learn it on your own. Go. Learn it on your own. And how does the father behave when the son comes back? Oh, back already? None of that. None of that I told you so. Just ready to welcome. Because the lesson's already been learned. And thus there's no need for any of that that's going to transpire. So when we're considering what it is that's happening here and the influences that are being had, it's not a simple situation to where you're just able to look at one particular individual. There's a chain in this as to why this action came about. There are multiple parties and multiple players that are engaged in this. To where when we want to be problem solvers. And that in solving the problems, we want to try to get down to the taproot of it. In some areas it's possible to do that, but then there's some areas where it's very difficult and almost impossible to do. Like we have a current situation going on with some of our brethren not here, but there's a situation going on with a sister, and when you're looking at it and trying to figure out what's happening with her and this other brother that's involved, and it's just, I don't know how to explain it. I just do not know how to get my head around it as to why she would be willing to go through and do the kind of things that she's doing. Because sometimes when it comes to doing the things that you do, there is no rationale. There is no way to explain it. It is just flat out illogical why it's happening. And so in those situations, it's just you do the best that you can. But then we do have situations like this where we can pinpoint it. We can play it out, and we find all the players that are involved. You have the influences around the table. You have Herodias. You have the mother-in-law that's involved in this. And then there's Herod at the center of it. And that even with all of this influence that's coming in on him, the buck stops with him. To where, okay, what are you going to decide here? What are you going to do? Are you going to uphold what's right, do what's right? Or are you going to fold? Or are you going to cave to the pressures? And the same thing that we're facing today. We have influences coming in from all different directions. but will we stand upon our own convictions as to what we know is truthful and what's right? Do you have something?
Oh, I was just gonna pop in what you said last week. We talked about 1 Corinthians 15:33,
Mhm.
just, as part of what's going on here.
Yeah.
About evil corrupting good morals and how that is a huge layer
Yeah.
of the underlying action.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll see it even more as we move into chapter 15 with our sermon. When it comes to traditions, that's outside influence, and how that can end up doing some great harm inside of the discussion of religion, but just everyday life as well. So yeah, we definitely need to keep that in mind as we move forward. So then we have all of this taking place, verse 12, and his disciples, John's disciples, came and took up the body and buried it and went and told Jesus. When Jesus heard of it, he departed thence by ship into a desert place apart, and when the people had heard thereof, they followed him on foot out of the cities. Now, Jesus and John are related. They're cousins. And here come the disciples, and they tell Jesus, okay, Jesus, your cousin is dead. Jesus heard of it, departed thence by ship into a desert place apart. Jesus does not stop to go and bury John. The disciples do that. And the reason for that is because the grave, though that has ended John's work, that just puts more focus on the work that Christ is about to do. And when we're considering the fact, okay, John is dead, John is buried, his work is done, what can he do? What can Jesus do at this point? It's not much he can do. Even though he has the power to raise people from the dead, he doesn't have the authority to do it in this occasion.
Would have been impressive to put a head back on.
Yeah, no joke. But when we're considering John at this situation, John's at rest. John is finally at peace. And especially going through what he's just endured, being in prison and now being beheaded. There's no reason to worry about John now. So we press on with the work. We keep going with it. And with the death of John, we see a contrast between his death and the death that Christ is going to endure and what Christ is going to then be able to make possible. With the death of John, that ends John's work, that concludes his work, but what about the death of Jesus? That just opens a new door. The work of Christ does not stop when he dies. He then goes on to be our high priest. He then goes on to be our mediator, our go-between. And that he is then busy in fulfilling and offering that full redemption to the entire world. But he does, as we're considering this, the work doesn't stop, but he does go away. Because he still is in the flesh, and when you have individuals in the flesh and they lose loved ones, what's the process? You grieve. When Moses and Aaron died, anybody know how long Israel grieved for them? It's a common number.
40.
It's 40 days.
Biblical number.
Yeah. 40 days the children of Israel grieved for Aaron first and then for Moses. But then what happened after that 40 days? No. You go on about your mission. It's said of Abraham in the book of Genesis, when Sarah died, he grieved for her. He mourned for her. But then he got up and went on his business, went on about his way. So Jesus departs to a desert place, trying to find some alone time. Because your cousin's just been beheaded by an evil tyrant. That's tough. That is injustice that's being brought upon the people. But payback's coming. Vengeance is going to be dealt out. And it's going to be dealt out very soon. Now, we look at it from the standpoint of, so 33 AD, around the time frame in which Jesus dies and the church is established. How long is it before Rome is destroyed? Or not Rome, Jerusalem, excuse me. 70 AD, so round about 40 years. For us, in that span of time, that's a long time to have to wait for retribution. But really, in the grand scheme of things, is 40 years really that long? Looking at you two in the back. I'm almost there. I'm 35.
Me too.
35 years old, and it's just like, where did the time go?
34.
Whatever.
You are getting old.
Wow.
You can't make yourself look
Well, he does have great hair.
Yeah, it does.
Ooh.
So here we are, and it's just, you know what? Just be patient. Just bide your time. Keep on pressing through and doing what you need to do. It'll come. So certainly we can understand why he would want to try to take a moment to grieve, to be alone. Just give me some space. Let me breathe. But what do we have happening? Here we have the multitude followed him on foot out of the cities. Jesus is taking a ship, but here they are, and they're walking out, following after, so as to keep going with what he has. Verse 14, Jesus went forth and saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion toward them, and he healed their sick. There is our phrase again from Matthew 9. What did we say about this phrase? To be moved with compassion.
Deeper than, oh, that's sad.
Okay, this is the deepest emotion of pity that you can have on a person. Just as Jordan said, it's more than just a emotion and a feeling of, oh yeah, this is terrible. Look how, look at their destitute decision. The difference is the fact that you have it moving. It brings about action. And thus that's what James says. What about a person's faith that says to a brother or a sister that's naked and hungry, be clothed and be filled? That doesn't do anything. For you to have, oh, well, I'm being sympathetic. Sympathy without action does nothing. And all of this going on in the midst of what Jesus is facing. So right here in the life of Christ, we have illustrated for us the very thing that Paul writes to the Philippian brethren about in Philippians chapter 2, verse 2 through 5. I believe it's verse 4. What does verse 4 say? Adrian should know this one because he brings it up all the time. So fulfill ye my joy by doing what? Having the mind of Christ, which is?
I think he said Philippians 4, and it's verse 7.
If I hadn't called him out, he would have been able to think of it. That you think on others before yourself. And is that not what Jesus is doing right here? My cousin is dead. The multitudes follow him. And we're going to find that they've come and it's evening and now they're hungry. Jesus doesn't look at his own situation and just say, hey, leave me alone. Look at what I'm going through. Why are you thinking about yourselves? Why aren't you thinking about me in this situation? The ability to be able to deal with what you're dealing with and be able to move along is a key key aspect of what we're needing to develop. And it goes back into the military situation illustrations that we have throughout the New Testament. You are in a firefight and you have a soldier that's next to you, more than likely somebody's going to get hit. And if your fellow soldier gets hit and dies there on the battlefield, do you have time to stop? Do you have time to address that? No. It's an acknowledgement. It's happened. Man down. But you got to keep going, or you'll be next. And Jesus is illustrating that. Okay, John is dead, but he's taken care of. Here is a multitude of people, and they still need help. So he is still mindful of others in the midst of this internal conflict. And thus we have Matthew 6:33, seek ye first the kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. As we said, John is okay. He's resting in Abraham's bosom. He's in paradise. Why be sad for him? Be sad for everyone else that's still alive and that is still having to struggle with what this world brings. And even as we get to the crucifixion of Christ, he's going to say that exact same thing. He passes through the city carrying his cross, and he sees widows and women standing by, and they're weeping for him. And what does he say? He says, don't weep for me, but instead weep for yourselves. Because what's about to happen to him, yes, it's terrible, but what's at the end of it? Glory is at the end of it.
I think their horrors are just about ready.
That's right. When it comes to the destruction of Jerusalem, what Jesus went through, it was bad. But even Jesus says of the destruction of Jerusalem, Matthew 24, there's no such tribulation that has happened or will ever happen again. And so when you're considering everything that Jesus went through, and yeah, it's severe, but then he says that about Rome coming in.
That's just hard to contemplate because, you know, history really, the history that the secular world teaches never talks about that.
Yeah.
And to know that that's what kind of atrocity happened, what we read from Josephus, just a little bit that we do know is horrifying.
Yeah.
And to know that Jesus made that prophetic statement that nothing did or will is really terrifying.
And then especially when you you bring the spiritual aspect into it as well. That here's what you're suffering through physically, and then you face damnation eternally. I mean, so life is hard already. Why would you want to go to hell on top of that? There's no need to do that. And that's what Peter would write about, that when we suffer for righteousness, it's better to suffer for righteousness than to suffer as an evildoer. If you're going to suffer, you might as well suffer doing the right thing. And thus, what Jesus is doing here. You help the multitude. You continue to feed them because they are struggling with everything that's going on. So 15 through 18, and when it was evening, his disciples came to him, saying, this is a desert place, and the time is now past. Send the multitude away, that they may go into the villages and buy themselves victuals. But Jesus said unto them, and there's a key point if you ever need an illustration as to why English is so difficult. Jesus said unto them, they need not depart, give ye them to eat. And they say unto him, we have here but 5 loaves and 2 fishes. He said, bring them hither to me. And he commanded the multitude to sit down on the grass, and he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and brake, and gave the loaves to his disciples, and the disciples to the multitude. And they did all eat, and were all filled, and they took up of the fragments that remained 12 baskets full. And they that had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Now, has anybody done any extra reading, connection reading, cross-reference reading? Does anybody know what this ties to? Or what other gospel account this ties to?
Would it be, I have not done any, but it would be in Acts?
Nope. Gospel account.
My cross-reference says Luke 9.
Okay. Is there another one?
Luke,
John 6 should be in there.
John 6.
John 6:16.
Yeah. Now, when you get over to John's account and you're reading through John 6 is a long chapter. And it's in that chapter where you have the discussion being had about the fathers eating manna in the wilderness and how they ate that bread and they died. But then Jesus gives the contrast to that now there's a bread that's brought down from heaven that if you eat of it, you shall live eternally. All of that discussion is being made in this same context, in the feeding of the loaves and of the fishes. So in order to appreciate what's happening here, you need to make sure you know what's going on in John chapter 6. Because John gives the record of the spiritual teaching that is behind these miracles that are being done. The spiritual teaching that's taking place because they desired, so let me just ask it. John 6, after he feeds them, what do they then want to do? What do the people want to do, the multitudes? John 6. What do you mean, what do I mean?
They want to eat.
No. They're fed.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
They want to be followed for more food.
All right. But there's something very specific that happens in John 6. They want to take
We're
him.
trying to make him a king.
All right. They want to try to take him by force and make him a king after he has fed them. So you see where their thinking is going. Oh yeah, this is what we want in a king. He gives us free stuff. But that's not what Jesus came to do. And thus the reason for all the explanation. Look, I'm not just doing this for the simple fact of feeding you. There is spiritual application behind what I'm doing that you're needing to recognize. That yes, I'm able to, perform this miracle, but what's the purpose of performing a miracle?
Confirm the word.
To confirm His message. That what I'm telling you is the truth and that I have come so as to set you free from your sins. And that you can be redeemed, that you can live eternally. So these miracles contained doctrinal teachings. The multiplying of the loaves, Jesus is bringing the bread of life into the world to feed them not only physically but to feed them spiritually. And it is in this occasion that many of the disciples stop following Him. And He turns to His apostles and He says, "Will you depart from me too?" And Peter, of course, being the way that he is, gives the response, "Where else are we supposed to go?" And he says, "You have the words of eternal life." Now, when we conclude chapter 14, we're going to see some further information as to what these events, the kind of effect they have on the apostles. But notice the contrast of attitudes between the Savior, the Christ, His apostles. Jesus' cousin has been killed. He goes away, but the multitudes follow Him, has compassion on them, and now they're hungry. And Jesus is ready to feed. But what's the attitude of the apostles? Get them out of here. Here we're watching the development of the apostles. They are not yet where they're needing to be. They are still very much struggling with this selfishness. Now, this is not the only time that we have a situation like this happening. Send them away mentality. When we get ahead to Matthew 19, the apostles are going to rebuke the ones that bring children to Jesus. And then they have to end up being rebuked there. In Matthew 21:31, the multitudes are going to be involved in rebuking the blind men that are following Jesus and continuously calling out to Him. So they have not reached the proper level of care for others. Now, can you just imagine it? That these are the ones that are going to be left behind to tend to the affairs of the church. And this is how they're behaving. Man, Jesus, you need to pick somebody else here. No, they'll be ready when the time comes. They just have to witness these things played out. Jesus is illustrating what He's going to teach in just a very little while. Who's the greatest in the kingdom? The ones that serve. Jesus did not come into the world to be ministered to, but to minister. The servant is not greater than his master. All of these teachings are going to be made, and here it is being practiced out. This is how Jesus behaved. He cared for others before He cared on Himself. The apostles have the mindset of send them away, and for what purpose?
They could go home.
Okay, who could go home? Well, not so much they could go home, but they're out in a desert place too. They've got to eat. So what's the mentality? All right, send them home, tend to us. Worry about us. See, there's too much us going on in this situation. And with everything that's going on in the life of Christ, and then He turns around and He says, no. Here's what we're going to do. So they say, tend to us, don't worry about them. And there are many in the church that are like this too. You have brethren, there are brethren that they want to hog the attention of the preacher, or they want to hog the attention of the elders, and they just want it all for themselves.
Christina.
And if the preacher or the elders, if they go off to tend to somebody else and they don't give this certain brother or sister the attention that they want, they pout about it. And they get disgruntled. That's what's going on here. You're wanting too much attention. Why don't you go give somebody else some attention? But you see, when it's all about me, I'm not thinking about anybody else. And when you consider, yeah, Jesus is in a tough place right now. But what about everybody else? They've left their homes. They've been walking out here by foot while we've been traveling on the water. And now it's evening and they've got nothing to eat. All right, what they're going through is tougher than what I'm going through. And if we step back and we consider others, there's always somebody else that's got it worse than us. It never fails. But the apostles aren't looking at it that way. Oh, well, we've got to eat. Well, it's not just a thing of you've got to eat. Everybody's got to eat. And then Christ steps in and He says, as we said, here's what we're going to do. So the apostles have this attitude, but then you consider what Jesus does. He commanded the multitude to sit down on the grass. Now, here we have further explanation as to doing Bible study and doing word study. Have you ever seen a desert have grass in it? They're in a desert place. All right, so when we read that, what came to your mind?
Sand.
All right, sand, Sahara, right? But that's not what desert means. Desert just means a wilderness. A wilderness place. So here we have, now we're sitting on grass. So you might need to change your perspective as to what you're reading here. And He took the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, and looking up to heaven, He blessed and brake and gave the loaves. Notice, He doesn't give the loaves straight to the people from himself. He gives the loaves to his disciples, and then the disciples give to the multitude. What do you think the point is in that?
Well, it's spiritual. They're going to be getting the brunt of the message from him because they're spending so much time with him, and then they have the responsibility to carry it.
Okay, very good. Very good. So there is a spiritual application in this that is leading forward, pointing to the coming of the church. Who's going to be involved in taking the message out? The apostles are. Okay, so if you're going to be taking the word out, the bread of life out, you need to be ready to serve. So there's that application. But what about in the moment right here?
You get to physically see how you're helping these people, and now it changes from, oh, get out of here to, wow, I'm glad I can help them.
Okay. Just a few moments ago, you were not wanting to have anything to do with them, but now Jesus is forcing you to serve them. And just as Jordan said, once you get in there and you start serving and you start tending and you get in close and you start recognizing what these people are going through, changes your perspective.
They change from the multitude to, hey, young lady, or
Right.
hey, little boy, or whatever.
Yeah. All of this is being done by design. You wanted to send them away. That's not what we're going to do. I'm going to have you serve them instead. And I can imagine there was some grumbling and some complaining that'd be going on here. Well, who are we to serve them and blah, 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 blah. And especially later, and I'm like, this is just coming to me. What's going to happen later in Acts chapter 6? All right, the widows are not being tended to. And what is it that the apostles end up saying in that situation? All right, you choose out men among you that are fit to do this, because it's not fit for us to set aside the preaching of the word so as to wait tables. Now, but you see, they've already done that. They recognize. That's the reason why they could recognize at that point how important that situation is. Because look at what they've already gone through. And look at what Jesus has already shown them. You don't just leave these people behind. Yes, what you're doing is important. What Jesus was doing was important. But he still stopped to feed them. And thus the apostles, they recognize, okay, we can't stop what we're doing, but we're going to set men in charge of it. Because they now know how vital this is to do. And so the application is for us too. While we are out here involved in the spiritual work of the kingdom and trying to save individual souls, what can we not neglect? We can't just turn a blind eye to the physical needs of others. But in our day and age, it's a bit more difficult. Because, well, it's not so, I mean, it really isn't different to what Jesus was facing, because you have loafers back then too. You have individuals that would try to work the system, they're looking for handouts and all these different things. And more than likely, that would be the ones that left him and decided, well, you know what? We're not going to follow this guy anymore, because he's trying to put too much restriction on us. He's actually trying to change us. To where in our day and age, we have so much that's being done by our government to the tending of others that oftentimes we lose sight of that work that we're supposed to be doing. And then you have so many that are on the welfare system and they're not actually going out and trying to work for themselves, to provide for themselves. And thus the Bible says in that situation, if a man's not going to work, he shouldn't eat. So when it comes to having compassion on people today, It's difficult because we get so jaded to what our system has produced. And that we have a lot of people that are just flat out lazy. But that's the difference between this crowd and, to a large degree, the crowd that we're going to be dealing with. They left their homes and were willing to follow him on foot. And thus he saw them and had compassion on them. All right, they've already put forth the effort. When they could have stayed home and filled their bellies themselves, they decided to come after me. But even with all of that being said and taken into consideration, we cannot become calloused to this. And there have been plenty of times where, in being involved in the work of an evangelist and trying to help people physically, I've been burned plenty of times. And you go through that enough and have people that just will not be serious about spiritual things, it gets very difficult to keep that compassion going. To where when the next person comes, that you'll be willing to follow through with this. And then we can end up becoming just like the disciples in this situation. Well, just send them away and let's focus on what we've got here. Can't be like that. Okay, so we already touched on the fact that the apostles are going to be the one to take the message out once Jesus leaves. And so what you have here, the resources. What's also being shown to the apostles in this situation, and not only to the apostles, but to the multitudes that are watching this, there's a great need that the people have. And the need that is supposed to be met, it cannot be done by yourselves. The resources that are needed to feed the world does not come from within us or from anything that we can actually offer. It must be by divine design. You have 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and then you're wanting to feed 5,000 people with that. How are you supposed to do that? There's nothing physically on this earth that can make that possible. This also is a reminding of the spiritual needs that must be met. And that spiritual means must be met by divine resources. You can't feed these people on your own. Thus a miracle. Man on his own cannot redeem himself from his sin. So what do you need? You need a divine source.
Goes back to John 6 where he says, I am the bread of life.
Exactly. John 6, in contrasting the manna that their fathers ate in the wilderness to now the bread of life that's come down from heaven, to which if you eat of that bread, never die. John 4, the woman at the well, water that he gives, live eternally. Can't get that on your own. Cannot do this by your own strength. And that's going to come into play when we look at Peter trying to walk on the water. What about that situation? You can't do that on your own. You got to have divine assistance. But in going out and walking on the water, what's the danger? You start out with divine assistance, but what do you start thinking?
I can't do it.
All right? You have the fears that creep in, and that's one angle of it, but what's the contrast to that?
I can't do this.
No, she already said that.
Okay. Couldn't hear it.
Say it. All right?
What'd you say?
That God can't do this, which goes into that fear aspect of it. But what about, huh?
Will God do it?
All right, we're still looking from fear.
Okay.
Let's move away from fear.
God can
Oh,
do
lack
this.
of faith.
All right. A lack of faith, which is based upon my ability. Overconfidence creeps in to where you start out walking and yeah, it's by faith, but then you start trudging out and what do you start thinking? Oh, look how good I'm doing. Look at what I'm doing.
Dad, watch this.
Yeah. And you start drifting down. If we lose sight of what's transpiring here, the only thing that made this possible is the spiritual resources. We will start going through our spiritual walk and we'll stop looking by faith and we'll start walking by sight. And to where we'll start giving ourselves all the credit of how good we are. And that's not what's making this possible. So again, in verse 20 and 21, they did all eat, were filled. They took of the fragments that remained 12 baskets full, and they that had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So not only is this a situation to where everybody's being filled, but then there's some that's left over. Fragments that are being left. Baskets that are being taken up. So what about what it is that God is able to do? What about that mindset that the apostles had before? Send them away. We don't have enough to feed everybody. We got to take care of ourselves. A lack of sight. A lack of faith. But just as we said last time, it's a lack of remembrance. Think about everything they've been through. You're telling me God can't handle this? See, so going back into the points that you were bringing up. The whole idea, well, yeah, God can do a lot of stuff, but He can't fix this. That's our problem. We start forgetting about who it is that we serve, who it is that we're following. To where all of these points should be stepping stones to get us into the next situation that we're in. It's just, hey, we can overcome this. We can make it through this. And it's not because necessarily of anything that we've got going on or just how great that we are. But it's the reality. Putting credit where it's supposed to be. Giving glory where it's supposed to go. God brought us through the last thing. God can bring us through the next. To where, when we have the apostles on the ship, and we've already discussed that in our sermon, they're out on the sea, and they're being tossed about with the winds and the waves. All right, we brought through one storm. What about this one? God can bring us through. We just watched Him. We just watched Him feed 5,000 people with this little scroungy amount. We'll be okay. But you see, if you're not remembering these things and you're not preparing your mind in that situation and getting yourself ready for the next situation, what about when you get in the next situation? If you're not prepared beforehand, it's too late.
Gonna go right back into where you were.
Exactly. Fall right back into your old mentality. So again, it's not just a point of we're coming in, we're listening to this stuff. Yeah, it's good stuff. We've got to hold on to it. We've got to try to retain what's being presented. Otherwise, when the struggle comes, what about the way of escape? So right here we have all the illustrations of ways of escape. If we're not thinking ahead and we're not remembering and we're not prepared, we won't see it. We won't be able to find it with what's already been laid out. So that's the feeding of the 5,000. Any thoughts, questions, comments? Additionally, generates any other thoughts, any other traces that your mind wants to follow? All right. And if there's nothing else, then we'll stop in that section of Matthew 14.